welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the men's division of Sarah Schneer. If you're exploring the idea of earning a degree but aren't sure where to start, you're not the only one. Maybe you're wondering whether your yeshiva credits will count, how to navigate financial aid, or which program actually leads to a career. That's where the men's division of Sarah Schneer can help. With degree paths in accounting, business, ABA, pre-med, psychology, paralegal, special education, and social work, you'll earn a degree from one of their prestigious partner colleges and be supported all the way through. From expert academic advising to a strong group of peers who learn and grow together, the experience is designed to help you succeed. And when you're ready to take the next step, their advisors are there to guide you, helping you choose the program that fits your goals and walking you through every stage of the process. Applications are open now for the full semester. Visit our website, www.sarash.com, that's SARASCH.com, or call 917-209-8204 to speak with a helpful advisor today. And you can find links and more information in the show notes below. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email me svarimchatter@gmail.com or see the link and information in the show notes below. You can also find a link to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community where I post new Svarim, new books, book deals, and so on. There's also now a Svarim Chatter WhatsApp status for those who prefer it that way versus a community. Post the same things, book deals, book news, Svarim news, as well as giveaways. The giveaways will more or less be exclusive to the WhatsApp status if you're interested in giveaways of books and Svarim, so check that out in the link below. Finally, if you can please subscribe to the podcast and rate and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen, Apple, 24/6, Spotify, and so on. And with that, enjoy this week's July 4th themed episode about the American Revolution and the Jews. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Adam Jortner, who is the Goodwin Philpott Professor of History at Auburn University. And we'll be discussing his fairly new book, which is A Promised Land, Jewish Patriots, the American Revolution, and the Birth of Religious Freedom, published by Oxford University Press. And I should say right at the beginning, it's only $35 list price. This is, for July 4th, this is a time when it's a good topic, I think, to discuss things like this. And this is, I'll get to if this is the first book on such a topic dedicated exclusively to this type of topic. But first, thank you, Professor Jortner, for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
Okay, let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. I am a professor at Auburn University where I teach American religious history. And this is my first foray into the history of American Judaism because I'm much more a historian of American Christianity. But of course, what I've realized over the years is if you really want to understand what's going on in American religion, you have to keep your eyes on both Christians and Jews because the Jews are the largest non-Christian organized religion in the States. So, if you want to know, hey, is this a Christian thing or is this an American thing? Is it going on in Judaism? Then it's an American thing. If it's not, probably a Christian thing. And that was sort of part of the genesis of me going back to take a look at the Jews of the Revolution.
Saying there in the beginning that, is this, I don't know if it's the first book on Jews and Revolution. I mean, is it like the first full length maybe in a while? I know there's been many books written on Jews in the Civil War, but Jews in the Revolution, I could be wrong on this, listeners could correct me, that there are maybe less. This is something, and in fact, and this is something you tackle in the book. So this question should really go hand in hand with people think when they hear about revolution and Jews, and you hear, there was no Jews at the time. Jews had nothing to do with the revolution. I'm sure you've gotten that also.
Yeah, well, I think that was part of the reason I wrote the book, is that I found out there were a lot of Jews in the revolution. There aren't many Jews in the United States, but they serve in the army and in the militia in direct proportion to their numbers, and Washington promotes them to be officers. And that's the first time a Jew is allowed to be an officer in a sort of a European or Christian army since the Roman Empire, which is pretty remarkable. And I think it goes to the fact that we don't really understand the religious world of the founding the way we might think that we do. People, there tends to be a real easy thing of, well, it was old-timey times, so every, quote-unquote, everybody is just a Christian. And that's not really what it looked like, and I found a really fascinating story. A lot of people wrote about the Jews in the Revolution, 100 years ago, and a lot of people wrote about it in the wake of the Second World War to sort of talk about the Americanness. But in the last 40, 50 years, there really hasn't been someone hasn't really taken it up and said, okay, what were they doing? What are the effects? How does this change the way Jews think about religious freedom? How does it change the way Gentiles and Christians in America think about religious freedom? And it was a real joy to sort of find out.
Yeah, and listen, some of this is still important to us today, how, America and its United States and its founding and how those early Jews impacted us. And we're going to get to that and the relationship with Washington. And Washington, specifically more than the other founders, that's something that you spend some time on in his relationship with Jews and what he thought of Jews and Judaism. So there's a lot to unpack here. But I think we should start at the beginning, as you kind of alluded to there, which is, what is the early American Jewish community at the time of the revolution? Let's talk about at the beginning, like numbers. You said it's very small. What are we talking about?
We are talking about, a grand total of maybe 3,000 individuals, which comes to 1/10 of 1%. And I know what you're thinking, man, that's a small group, and you are right. But don't be fooled. Just because numbers aren't the same thing as importance. Just because don't have a lot of people, small groups of people can have an outside effect on history. A lot of the Jews end up in what's going to be the United States. They come from places in the Caribbean where there are already established Jewish communities. Some of them come from London. Some of them come from elsewhere in the diaspora. But by and large, they're Sephardic at first, and then more Ashkenazic Jews sort of join. And they start forming communities. The first synagogues in the New World are all in the Caribbean. They're in South America. You finally get a synagogue in the U.S. or in British North America in New York, and you get one in Charleston. There's one in Philadelphia. There's one in Newport, Rhode Island. And then there's also a Jewish community in Savannah that doesn't have a synagogue. But basically, it's five communities in 5 different towns. And they have some degree of religious freedom, which is to say they have the freedom to practice. It's legal to practice Judaism, but they are not full citizens. They do not, because they are Jewish, they do not get to participate in any kind of political life. There are professions that are closed to them, and there are various legal restrictions. In some states, they're not allowed to testify. In French colonies, Jews aren't allowed to live at all. They have codes blocking them from living anywhere in a French-speaking New World colony. So that's the sort of situation. When the war begins, it was part of New World Jewry, but New York isn't the center of Judaism in the New World. That's in places like Jamaica, for example. Kingston has a significant Jewish community.
Yeah, I did a podcast on Jamaican Jews with Professor Cameron Nervous a while back for those interested. So, and really, we should talk about where these Jews are from. These are mainly Spanish and Portuguese descendants. These are Jews from the main community in Amsterdam and London and Hamburg, and then they're spreading out all over. Right? That's predominantly of these 3,000 Jews. That's what we're talking about at this time.
That's correct. Most of them are I'll put it this way. They were mostly people who had been bounced around quite a bit, which is to say. Again, the leading port cities in the British Empire are not on the North American mainland. But you have, and it's a real mixed bag, which is to say the first Jews who get here are Sephardic, and so first Jews who come here are Sephardic, so the synagogue's liturgy is in the Sephardic tradition. But later, more Ashkenazic Jews show up, and there's pretty diverse group of Jews sort of all trying to get along because they don't have the resources to form a second synagogue, nor probably would it have occurred to them. This is a time where you have one Jewish community, there's going to be one synagogue. Everybody works it out.
Right. This is before Reform and other part. That hasn't started. None of that started here yet. And you don't really have Ashkenazi and Sephardi. There's really, like we were saying, there's really just one, more or less. There are some Ashkenazim, but
I think that the important thing to remember too here is that that's not in Europe at the time. one synagogue for one community isn't by choice. In many European countries, Jews have a highly restricted status. They can't move around. They can't choose their own professions. And the synagogue is sort of deputized by the Christian state to run the Jewish community. So if, whoever is the rabbi is also leading the community backed by the state. That isn't to be like, oh, those evil rabbis, but it is to sort of point out that in Europe, the idea of getting to choose your own synagogue and having a say in the religious life of your community is a little foreign. It's not something that would have necessarily come up.
Yeah, this is the old, but they used to have the Kehillah, and this was they were taxed, and everything ran through. They had their kind of self-governed community within the community, whatever country they were. So what about I think it's worth at least discussing the genesis of the American community. You have the kind of the myth. It's like the original 23. I guess it kind of goes like with the Mayflower. Right? It goes hand in hand, right? Something like that.
Yeah, the May Schlepp, is that a joke? I don't know. The original 23 who show up in New York City in 1654 are actually refugees from Brazil. Brazil, initially Portuguese, becomes Dutch. Netherlands takes it over. Netherlands allows Jews to live there. And then the Portuguese recapture it. So the Jews are again kicked out. And they sort of end up in New York kind of by accident. There's a lot of minutia regarding these 23 people. But I just sort of want to point out that they're not the first Jews in what becomes the United States, because, of course, in the Southwest, a lot of conversos, the crypto Jews, have come up from Mexico. Mexico, for a while, is a place where Mexico, again, the conquest of Mexico by Spain, 1521, right not long after Ferdinand and Isabella kick all the Jews out, and there are this rash of crypto Jews, and they come to Mexico. Some of them come up into New Mexico. So American Jews come from a lot of different places, but by the start of the American Revolution, at least on the Eastern Seaboard, they're really mostly in these 5 communities: New York, Philly, Savannah, Charleston, Newport.
Yeah, and these are big cities at the time. One more general question: what are generally their occupations?
A lot of among the men, of course, a lot of them are in trades, particularly a lot of them are getting involved in the fur trade. And a lot of them are in some ways involved in the maritime industries. But again, this is a pretty diverse group, so that you do have a lot of merchants, but you also have, again, being a merchant is sometimes sitting in a counting house, and it's sometimes marching into Native American territory and negotiating for fur exchange. So a lot of diversity of occupation.
So you mentioned before that at this time Jews were not able to hold public office. They were kind of limited as a citizen at this time before the revolution. So what was the opinion of the general American public? The general American, what opinion did they have towards the Jews?
Well, let me jump in here and say we don't know, because there's no opinion polls.
Letters or things like that.
Yeah.
Or pamphlets or books.
If we're asking sort of what's the general opinion of a British colonist towards the Jews, that's a hard question to answer. And I'm going to actually say, I'm going to answer a different question, which is, what's the opinion of the state towards the Jews? Sometimes in America, we have this, because this is a democracy, we sometimes have this illusion that, like, well, whatever the public opinion is what the government will do. That is not true. But I can tell you very distinctly what the opinions about Jews are by the governments of the various states in Britain. They are broadly tolerated, which means they're allowed to live and they're allowed to settle with the approval, with the permission of the government. So they need to have special dispensation even to show up. They're not citizens. They're not nobody's a citizen. They're all subjects of King George, but they're not subjects. They're considered to be foreigners. Sometimes they're referred to as residents, but they don't have the same legal status. They can't serve in public office. To the extent that these people vote, they can't vote. And I mean, this is a very typical thing. I think it's less true in the British colonies than it is in Europe. But again, when trouble's afoot, the Jews are frequently the targets of the blame. We don't have any massive pogroms like the kind we see in Europe. But for example, when there is a kerfluffle in Rhode Island, for example, at the end of the 1600s, there's an effort to take all the Jews' property, and that actually happens twice, and it gets defeated. But again, there's this effort to do it. There's a case in 1737 where one candidate loses and then claims he's really won because Jews got to vote. And we have no evidence whether Jews actually did vote in that election, but that's the story, and they pass a law saying, we don't know if Jews were voting, but they definitely can't vote. So this sort of thing, it sort of varies colony by colony. And of course, there is no such thing as religious freedom. Very famously in the 17th century in Maryland, there was a Jew who had arrived via a ship who claimed that Jesus was not the Messiah and had his tongue bored through because that's blasphemy. It's a public offense to have to say anything against Jesus of Nazareth.
I mean, listen, New England, which we haven't really discussed, as a Puritan. I mean, those are the Puritans left England to go there. So this is a heavy. I will get into some of the Puritans and some of the important figures of New England.
Yeah, I love the Puritans. I can't get enough, so be careful.
Okay, well, we'll talk about, well, some of the listeners are probably like, what is a Puritan? So we'll get there shortly. But I do want to ask you, going from the state to founding fathers. So Washington aside, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, what are their, and Alexander Hamilton, who I also did a podcast with Professor Porwencher in his book about Hamilton, what are their opinions towards Jews? And this is especially important as we're going to now get to the United States of America.
Yeah. Because I think that's part of my book is there's a big shift between the colonies and the U.S. It's not this seamless transition for Jews. There's a big break. And one thing I found is that most of the founding fathers have, how should we say, negative opinions towards Judaism. But many of their public acts defend Jewish rights to be citizens, defend Jewish rights to worship. They embrace freedom of religion, even though they don't personally like Jews. Just about every founding, if you there's a wonderful archive called founders.org. You can look up all kinds of quotes from the founders, and they've got all the footnotes. It's a lovely, founders.org is a wonderful resource. And if you look up Jews in founders.org, which I have, you don't have to dig very far to find pretty cruel and insulting things said about the Jews. Particularly thinking about John Quincy Adams, but also even Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson says the Talmud is a mishmash of nonsense, and he says some very cruel things about the Torah. But Washington appoints Jews to federal office. He doesn't allow and he's perfectly happy if Jews are willing to be citizens. He's ready to go. So you have this interesting, it is, I think, the experience of the revolution that in many ways gives some of these founding fathers their first real experience of working with Jewish patriots. And I think expands their concept of what freedom of religion really is going to look like. Because almost all the founding fathers, especially the good ones, the really popular guys, your Hamiltons, Jeffersons, Adams, Washingtons, Franklins, almost all of them are vociferously on the side of full Jewish freedom. You can dig around and find some founders who are not, but anyone who knows who Gouverneur Morris or John Jay is, okay, you're right. Those guys, Even after the revolution, they were like, I don't know about these Jews. But, most of us don't go to Gouverneur or to John Jay to tell us what the founders think. So in some ways, it's the Jewish patriots themselves who help push the envelope here. Because the Jews joined the patriot cause, because they joined it vociferously, they are doing a lot of the work to demonstrate not only defeat stereotypes, but also to show this idea of a self-governing nation, this idea of a country where all men are created equal and it's the individual who has rights, how broad that idea can be, especially in terms of religious freedom.
So were most Jews then patriots? Or, there obviously were some loyalists.
There are some loyalists, but the Jews by and large are patriots. One of the more obscure founders is a guy named Benjamin Rush. And he said the Jews in all the states are patriots. And Ben Rush, as far as I know, is the only founding father ever to go to a bar mitzvah. He writes, and he writes about it what most of us would still write. He says, "Well, it was a really interesting service. Everyone was talking through the whole thing, so I had a hard time figuring out what was going on." So that is something that is still. But Benjamin Rush has that statement. We have one thing that really stands out, and this is the cool part. So you have 5 cities with synagogues, but by 1780, 4 of them have been knocked over by the British. Right, Newport, Savannah, Charleston, and New York City, all under British control. So 1780, the only city that has a synagogue that's a patriot city is Philadelphia. And then something really interesting happens. All of the Jewish patriots who can make it, who have the means to leave an occupied city, end up in Philadelphia. So you get Jews from Savannah, from Charleston, from Rhode Island, from New York, all in the city of Philadelphia, and they actually refound the local synagogue, Mikveh Israel. It's still there today. They refound the synagogue as a national organization. They get rid of the Pennsylvania-only board of the junta is what it's called. They get rid of the board, and they put in a new direct board of directors that has people from all over the country. They make a New Yorker becomes the Hazan, effectively the rabbi. They install a guy from Pennsylvania as the president. When there are some disagreements, they call on a guy from Georgia. And it's this sort of intercolonial group that has now become a national group. And here's something that's very interesting. It is a kind of an accident of geography, but of course they make a very democratic small d synagogue. It's much more based upon the desires of the individual members. And they invite all the local officials to come visit their synagogue. And one thing you do have in Judaism that you don't really get in other religions for a while, it's one of the first national religions, which is to say, one of the first religious groups that organizes itself as a national group, self-consciously national group. And of course, these synagogues are going to be independent, but it's thinking in an American way. It's thinking not as we're a state or we're a colony or we're a city, but we are a American group of Jews, and every synagogue in the United States by the end of the 1780s is led by somebody who was there at Mikveh Israel. So in some ways, Judaism becomes one of the first national religions in America. And again, that doesn't, change any. I mean, there are plenty, again, the Catholics and Baptists are not far behind, but it gives us a sense of how diverse, how different this world was when you think of, one of the first, if not the first national religious organization are a bunch of Jews. That says something about just how radical this American Revolution was and the kinds of people who are involved.
Yeah, and they have a constitution to mimic the United States Constitution. So we'll get back to that. I think we want to get to some other things specifically about the New York and the Philadelphia community as well. I think there's we left out Washington, so we shouldn't forget about Washington because they're probably listening. How'd you leave out Washington? So George Washington, And this is actually how you start the book with Moses Seixas. By the way, Seixas, we'll get to Gershom Seixas shortly, Seixas. So what happens there? The letter, this is famous, I think. The letter of the Newport, Rhode Island community. There's the shul of the Torah synagogue, but there's the letter that they send to Washington and Washington's response to bigotry, no sanction. I think this is kind of famous. So if you want to talk about Washington and his relationship with Jews and his attitude towards Judaism and freedom of religion in this country.
Yeah, and I think Washington is a key dude. What the story that I start with is some people may be familiar with it. George Washington goes to Newport, Rhode Island, and he is greeted by all these functionaries and local political leaders and members of the clergy. And one guy from the synagogue is there with the other clergymen, and he hands Washington a letter. Essentially, this guy is Moses Seixas, one of the post-war leader of Newport's Jews. And Seixas asks Washington essentially, are Jews going to get full rights here? We have been deprived heretofore of our natural rights, and we participated in the revolution. So what are you, Washington, going to do? And Washington's response, and now quite famous, where he says, the U.S. government gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, asking only that those who people deem themselves as good citizens, which is to say there is not a religious test you have to take to be an American. I mean, again, what is Washington's position on this? There's no religious test you have to take to be an American. Period, full stop. That's literally what he says. And there's even more layers to this, which is, of course, this is incredibly trivial, but it's neat. Rhode Island doesn't join the Union after the war. All the other 12 states have accepted the Constitution, but Rhode Island's holding out. They're holding out because they're like, oh, we don't know about this. So 1791, they finally get around to joining, and that's the context in which Seixas comes to ask Washington this, because even though Rhode Island is sort of known as this really cool place where there's lots of tolerance, a lot of the leadership in Rhode Island at the time was not too hip on Jewish rights. So here is Moses Seixas literally not just asking, hey, are we going to continue this? But, well, now that we're in the Union, how far is this freedom of religion thing really going to go? In other words, he's asking for his rights, and Washington comes back and says, absolutely. And this is pretty standard for Washington. Every time Washington gets a letter from one of the larger religious groups, at the time, those are people like the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians. Those people write him letters a lot, and he writes back usually with pretty measured tones. I'm glad. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Good to hear from you. When smaller religious groups write to him, at the time, Jews, Catholics, Baptists, Unitarians, he writes back with this effusive praise for how great it is that they're part of this American experiment. And I think the implication here is clear. Washington's a fairly standard issue Episcopalian. He definitely was a Christian, no doubt about that. I think he's a devout Episcopalian, which is our Jewish listeners may not know this, but it for many Christians, a devout Episcopalian is hard for them to conceive, but it does happen. But he's really interested in political terms in building the biggest tent he can, religiously speaking, which is to say he really does not seem to put much a weight on the idea that there's only one religious class of citizens who are capable of ruling. And again, I think, Nachi, this is really important because there are now people who make the claim that it is only American Christians who are capable of being citizens. And this is an extreme point of view, but one we need to be aware of, and to understand that this is not just something that is upsetting or rude or not nice, but that this is something that was fundamentally at odds with the founding of the American Republic. And the founding of the Republic, there are a lot of sins built into the founding of the U.S., and I'm not pretending that. But one thing I certainly can say is, if there is one place where we see freedom expand after the revolution, it's in religious freedom. There is much more religious freedom after the revolution than there was before. And part of that is Jewish patriots who join the fight and who afterwards press for their rights, their full inclusion as citizens in the body politic.
I want to give you the opportunity at least to talk about the Puritans, what a Puritan is, and at least explain their position on the Jews, because we're in Rhode Island now in this part of the conversation. We're in New England. The Puritans, as Styles and Increase Mather, Cotton Mather, tell the list some of these colorful figures, and we know that they knew Carrigal. Isaac Carrigal was there. Tell the listeners a little bit about what a Puritan is and what some of these figures, what their relationship is, or lack of, their opinion of the Jews.
Yeah, well, I teach a whole class on the Puritans. I can't get enough of them. There isn't one. Something to point out is this is a little inside baseball, but bear with me, everybody. There's not just one kind of Puritan. Like, so the Massachusetts is a Puritan stronghold, and then people who are object to the way Massachusetts is running things go down and form Rhode Island. And then some people who didn't think Massachusetts was being tough enough in defending Puritan orthodoxy, they found Connecticut. So there was a saying in the 18th century, if you're too bad for Massachusetts, you go to Rhode Island. If you're too good for Massachusetts, you go to Connecticut. The Puritans are very severe Protestants. They're not nearly as dour as they're given credit for. But they have a very clear view that not only their salvation, of course, only comes through Jesus Christ, and they also believe that church communities need to be self-forming, which is to say you can't compel anyone to join the church. And in fact, Puritans make it kind of hard to join. Puritans are often fighting about how hard it is to join their churches. Now, within that, there are a lot of different attitudes you could take. For example, in Rhode Island, the general view is you can't compel anyone to join a church. Therefore, the state can't be involved in churches whatsoever, which is kind of the ethos that grows there. In Massachusetts, they say you can't compel anyone to join a church, but only Christians can rule. And that's sort of their take on that. But this isn't consistently applied over all the centuries. Often the early Puritans they really like the biblical Jews. They're not so hot on any modern day Jews that happen to show up, unless those guys convert. There are, very famously, there are two guys in Connecticut who are Jewish at the time of the Revolution, but they're mostly famous. They're Jews who are famous for not being Jewish. They convert to Christianity and go to Yale. But you have also guys like Ezra Stiles, who becomes a real Rhode Island leader of the Revolution, and he has this sort of contradictory views, which is to say he loves going to Jewish services. We know he goes to Purim services. He'll stop by to just listen to the sermons in the synagogue. But he also, again, whenever something goes wrong with the revolution, he's very quick to blame the Jews. He's always thinking that there's a Jewish conspiracy. He sometimes thinks George III is in cahoots with the world's Jews, and that Parliament operates a secret Jewish conspiracy out of a store in London. And one of his friends actually writes to him. It literally says, "I think you must be mistaken about the ministerial Jew store." It isn't, and again, it is Rhode Island that tries to seize Jewish property at one point. Whereas Massachusetts, which is supposedly the stricter place, a guy named Aaron Lopez is actually able to get citizenship there after a very long rigmarole. So the Puritans have this sort of they think of themselves as a new Israel. So they're not super duper hot on like the existing people of Israel. But again, what I think is important is not sort of the private thoughts of the leaders, but what is their public policy? And what is absolutely fascinating to me is in 1790. Religious, Massachusetts still has a state church. Massachusetts still has a state church in 1790, but they have religious freedom. And a Jewish guy runs for public office. A guy named Moses Michael Hayes runs for public office. He gets 1 vote, but he runs. He does it. And again, in other places of Virginia, for example, Jews are actually elected to public office in the 1790s, which is indicative here. It is one thing to sort of look at, we obviously want everyone to be understanding. We want everyone to understand Judaism and I would say all religions with a great deal of empathy, with understanding and compassion. Not the same as agreement. But I also think it's very important that you can't take someone's private opinion about a group as indicative of what they will do in public. That people can say very nice things about the Jews in private and then castigate them in public or pass laws that discriminate against them. And the same thing is true. People can say, again, Jefferson says some rough stuff. Definitely hires Jews.
Yeah, listen, definitely contradictory in some sense. But, okay, we talked about a bunch of different things, but we didn't. We left out Seixas still here. So we should talk about the Reverend, or as you call him, the Rabbi of the Revolution. But he's not trained as a rabbi, though. He doesn't have smicha. Nope. And Gershom Seixas, again, so Gershom, Gershom, Seixas, 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 if I'm pronouncing it right. So, what's his background? What's his training or lack thereof? And how does he come into this position? What's his position? Let's talk about him.
Yeah, Seixas is Gershom Seixas, brother of Moses Seixas, son of he's both Ashkenazi and Sephardim, so that's extremely convenient. He takes over the Jewish community in New York. In 1773, I think that I may be wrong about that, but it's not long before the revolution. He is the first guy they have there to run their community who was actually born in New York, and the New York community is one of these very diverse groups of Jews. That again, shocker, the community is full of fights and arguments. And the community goes through, they don't have a rabbi. They want to hire a rabbi, but a rabbi's got to have a yeshiva degree. And in British North America, they can't afford that. So they hire guys, hazans, they're called, to lead the services. And Gershom becomes the hazan. By all accounts, does a pretty good job of it, has no formal training as a rabbi. I think he owns a prayer book. He's got access to a Torah, and I think he's got a copy of the Shulchan Aruch, and that's about it. So it's a little catches when you sort of comparing this guy to a modern trained rabbi would be wrong. But he's the Jewish leader in New York. Everybody's calling him rabbi, and he doesn't stop him from doing that. So sometimes they call him reverend. Sometimes they call him father. He gets all kinds of names. Anyway. What's critical about Gershom is that when Congress, in 1776, Congress calls on all Christian clergy to have a day of fasting and prayer for the United States. Congress specifically uses the word Christian clergy. Interestingly, when Washington repeats Congressional Declaration, he edits out the part about it being Christian clergy. He just says a day of fasting and prayer. Gershom doesn't need to do it, but he says, you know what? We're going to do it. This synagogue, Shearith Israel of New York City, still there. This synagogue, we're going to have a day of fasting and prayer to support the Patriot cause. And he gives sermons on behalf of the Patriots. He very much imbibes this idea of the individual is the source of authority and legitimacy in any government. You can't be legitimacy doesn't come from being the king or having the right blood. Legitimacy comes from, do the people support it? And this is sort of the basic idea of a republic, which is you poll the people, they elect those that they find to be the right people, and that makes it legit. That public support is what makes legitimacy. And Seixas no doubt understands that this is something that has never happened in Europe, that is happening here in North America. It is an opportunity for Jews to be full citizens, a place where their faith, their family background does not prevent them from achieving what they can achieve and sort of being able to contribute and live lives with equality. And so Seixas gives this sermon, and a couple months later, the British attack New York, and Seixas takes one of the Torahs out of Shearith, Israel, and he brings with him most of his congregation out to Connecticut, where, again, no Jews in Connecticut. Connecticut, 1776, Connecticut is the Provo, Utah of 1776. No offense, Provo, I love you. But it is just not a very Jewish area. And they probably make the first minyan ever in Connecticut. And they form a congregation there in Connecticut where they live in exile for a while, rather than, which is to me quite distinctive. The British, by and large, don't rule with a heavy hand in New York against the Jews. But Seixas would rather live in Patriot Connecticut in exile than live under British Tory rule in New York. And I think that is part of what builds his reputation. He goes on to become the Hazan in Mikveh Israel, in leading the new national Jewish community. And he really becomes the leader, the most prominent American Jew for the next 30 years.
And I don't know if you mentioned his distinctive dress. There's a picture of him in the book, and anyone familiar, just Google him, you could see. So he's got this kind of Christian clergy dress.
He wears an Episcopal robe. I mean, it's not an official. I do not know what makes an official Episcopal robe, but he looks like a Christian clergyman. He goes around with the Christian clergyman, and this is, I think, remarkable. Indeed, there are certain times in the 1780s, when they're trying to pass the Constitution, and when they're celebrating the victory over the British, where places like Philly and New York make an effort to be sure that the Jewish leader, the Jewish rabbi, marches with the Christian clergy as a sign of, hey, this is the new kind of community we have. Not just being like, yay, we're so diverse, but to say, this is a place where everyone is free to worship as they wish. You get to decide how you think God should be worshipped. The state doesn't decide for you. You get to pick, and you shouldn't suffer disabilities because of that.
And as you said, he ends up in Philadelphia. He ends up in Mikveh Israel, and that he's, there's a praise for the Americans, he prays for Washington, and then there's a new synagogue. That's the whole controversy. I don't know if you'll mention that. And then Franklin gives them money towards the new synagogue, and then there's the fight on the location. Is it allowed to be the German Reformed Church? They get in a fight whether they're free or not free. Are they actually free?
Yeah, it's not, again, it's not all, I don't want to give the impression that it's all smooth sailing. When the Jews pick a new location where they're going to build their new synagogue, and it is right next to a German Reformed church. And the German Reformed church couldn't have known how this was going to sound in 2025. But the German Reformed church says, we don't really want those Jews around. And in the end, the synagogue has to move. They at a loss. They lose money in that deal. But again, this was in 1782. It's indicative to me of the changes. Again, in 1780, the Jews have to move locations. As time goes on, after the revolution is over in 1783, that's going to stop being the case. Another great example, this is a minor example, but in the year 1808, there are sort of there's a political crisis in British Quebec, and there's a political crisis in North Carolina. Each legislature, the Quebecois legislature and the North Carolina legislature, they each elected a Jewish guy. And in both places, Jews, they were supposed to take every legislator has to take an oath on the New Testament. In in Quebec, they kick the guy out. In North Carolina, they say the guy's name is Jacob Henry. He gives this big speech about how great it is to live in a free country, and he keeps his seat. Again, it's not a utopian situation. It would be better if Jacob Henry had never had to defend his religious faith at all. But again, looking around comparatively in what's going on in 1808, we have an exact example where it's a pain for Henry, but he keeps his seat. The will of the people, and he makes a point, and Jefferson makes a point, and a lot of the founding fathers make this point. If you don't allow certain people to serve in public office, you're not only violating their rights, but you're violating the rights of the voters, because the voters have the right to pick the person they think is best. And if you come in and you say, you can't run because you're Jewish, or you can't run because you are Catholic, or you can't run because you're a Muslim or a Hindu or an atheist or whatever, you're taking away the right of the people to elect the person of their choice, which is, that's not a point that neatly fits into, modern American politics, but it's true nevertheless.
I do want to get more to elected officials, and especially as it comes to the noted debate on the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. But just before that, Jews in the American Army. We didn't mention this. We did mention in the beginning that they fought. So how many Jews fought in the Army? Are there any notables that you can mention for the listeners that fought in the American Army during the Revolution?
Sure. We think the number is something close to, again, the number of Jews in the Army was probably 0.1% of the Army. Again, that's their exact number in terms of the population. They serve in proportion to their numbers in the population, which is remarkable because, of course, in Europe, Jews can't serve as officers. Again, every army in Europe at the time is an extension of not just the state, but the church. They are Christian armies, and you can't have a Jew giving orders to Christian armies. What are you, nuts? But again, Washington, for reasons that are not clear, is not bothered by this idea. My own suspicion is some of it was probably, his own personal feelings. But let's be clear, Washington needs everybody he can get. And again, let's be clear about Washington. He initially didn't want to allow any black soldiers to serve in the army. And, that lasts about 8 minutes before he's like, oh, no one wants to serve in my army. Okay, let me change that policy. Again, this is not to be, it's not a glowing moment for George Washington. But he needs bodies. And when they get promoted, they generally serve well. There's a couple guys. One of my favorite guy is probably Solomon Bush, who's becomes I think a lieutenant in the army. He's injured at the Battle of Brandywine, and then he's sort of captured and kept under house arrest at Philadelphia. What does he do in Philadelphia? He becomes a spy, and he's watching all the British officers doing their stuff behind enemy lines in Pennsylvania, and he gets the information to Washington. So that's that. There are a lot of guys, but there are sort of guys who show up. There's one guy, Elias Pollock, who signs his name as Joseph Smith, because he's probably afraid his background will prevent him from serving. There was a group in the Battle of Beaufort that was in South Carolina that was called the Jew Company. 28 of the 40 guys were Jewish. And we don't know that they got together and say, hey, let's form a Jewish company. But it was the fact that this was a company of militiamen formed from a Jewish neighborhood. In other words, putting together this Patriot militia, they did not stop and say, whoa, that's the Jewish neighborhood. Avoid that. Who knows what will, if you let a Jew join the army, who knows what will happen? They don't say that. They're just like, yeah, come on in. And then there are just a lot of guys who serve, and we know their names, and we know a tiny bit about them. But simply we know there's a medic at Valley Forge who's Jewish and fights smallpox. Well, we know there's a guy serving in New York who had to go and say, look, I can't serve guard duty on Shabbat, and they say that's fine. You don't serve it on Shabbat. You can do it the other 6 nights a week. So there isn't sort of one outstanding example where you point to and be like, this is the guy who did it. But just by showing up, just by being patriots and offering their service and in some cases their lives for the cause, they advance the cause of religious freedom.
So, religious freedom. More specifically, when it comes to the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, so those pro-federal government, anti-federal government, it comes to the Bill of Rights, they're discussing it. This is all going on post-Constitution. What's going on? Where do the Jews fit into this specifically? I mean, religious freedom in general, but as specifically as it relates to Jews here in our conversation.
Yeah. So you have, so the revolution ends. There is a long period for about 4 years where the American colonies are trying to work together, and then the big transformation is the creation of the Constitution. Now there aren't no Jews in the Constitutional Convention. Everybody, nobody at the time in 1787 when they write the Constitution, it was done. We forget this. It was done in secret. We today have Madison's notes from the Constitution, which are great and absolutely worth reading, but they didn't have it at the time, so nobody knows what's going on in there. We know that the issue of religious freedom almost never comes up in the Constitutional Convention. In fact, the closest they get to a religious decision is when, a couple of weeks into it, when things are going pretty rough, they're like, maybe we should call in a pastor to say a prayer before we start. And the Constitution votes no. They say, no, we're not doing that, which is, odd, but that was the choice they made. There's very little discussion of it in Philadelphia. When the Constitution goes out to the states, this is where the issue begins to come up. And there are many questions about the Constitution because, please see the 82,000 books that have been written on it. I would recommend Pauline Meyer's book, Ratification, is my favorite. But anyway, this question of could a Jew be president does come up. Sometimes they say, could a Muslim be president? And very occasionally they even whisper, could an infidel, could someone who doesn't believe in a God be president? These questions come up. I wouldn't say they're the most prominent, but they're certainly they come up in the debates that people write in newspapers and in the constitutional the ratifying conventions themselves when the states vote on it. And by and large, most people all of the states that end up voting for the Constitution, by and large, ask there to be amendments added. And all of them want an amendment about religious freedom. And in some very famous debates, for example, North Carolina has a really interesting debate over the Constitution. Not only were they worried that a Catholic could be president, they were worried that maybe the Pope would be president. And a man named James Iredell, who later serves on the Supreme Court, has to gently remind everybody, well, the Pope is usually Italian, 1776. Pope's probably going to be Italian, so he can't be president. Notice the president has to be a native-born citizen. But it's the same question of if you have a state that doesn't require people to be Christians or officeholders to be Christians, can you guarantee that it will be an ethical state? Can you guarantee that everyone's going to be making good and kind decisions? And there is this debate about it. And by and large, the answer is yes. We can make sure, we can see to it that people who cannot take an oath on the New Testament or even an oath to believe in God could still be moral. And the real ringer in this debate is James Madison himself, who sort of points out, he says, listen, if you think you have to swear on the Bible before you take office, you believe in something. Usually it's the New Testament. Sometimes they ask people if they believe in Jesus Christ as the Savior. He says, listen, if you think making people take that oath guarantees that you don't get liars in government, you're wrong. Because, of course, if someone is a liar, they will have no problem just taking that oath. And he actually says you're actually keeping people out who would do a good job and who are honest. And that was very much the spirit of the day. I found I looked at all the different, I looked at a whole lot of stuff about the Constitution, not the convention itself, but what average Americans say about it. almost every group, every state has something about religious freedom. And occasionally you do get people who say, no, this constitution is no good because it has to be a Christian government. It has to be an explicitly Christian government. And those voices are in the minority. And nobody proposes an amendment that says only Christians shall hold office. And again, I point this out because people today will sometimes make the argument that the Constitution is an explicitly Christian document, and the United States is an explicitly Christian nation. And much of this is a nonsense argument, but again, it makes sense if you don't know that the founders actually talked about it. If you just assume the founders are all Christian and it's old-timey times, and so they they must have never even mentioned it because there were no Jews anywhere or nobody of a different religious flavor. That's not true. There are Jews in the early republic. In many ways, they prompt this debate. There are also guys called deists who believe in God but deny the reality of the Bible. And that's guys like Ethan Allen is a deist who says that sort of thing. So they did have these debates. And if we are serious about looking to the revolution as a basis for our government today, our republic today, we have to take those debates. I want to take those debates seriously. And again, most of these, the majority of the guys said, yes, Jews are in. It doesn't matter what your religion is. And certainly when it came time to draft the Constitution, drafting the Bill of Rights, those are the things that come out. And not, there's the words Christian nation won't be found in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights.
And as it pertains to the oath, Alexander Hamilton, there's this fascinating case in New York where, first of all, one of the arguments why the Jews say Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur, so they, they do away with all their, all their oaths. They don't care. They're just, and so Hamilton has not only about that, but about the case there at hand. And Hamilton, who was a Federalist, and I talk about this, that the Jews ended up being Jeffersonian more than Federalist, but Hamilton defends the Jews. He's the lawyer at the New York Court of Appeals, which is like the New York main court, like the Supreme Court, but just for those who aren't familiar, the New York Court of Appeals, yeah.
Right. There's this famous case in 1800 where this question comes up for lack of a better word, it comes up for real, which is to say there's literally a case, the question of which is, can a Jew be believed under oath? Which is to say, if you are a court, do you have to accept the testimony of a Jew? And the argument goes back to one of the greatest hits of anti-Semitism, and this is in the Kol Nidre service on Yom Kippur. Whoever is leading that service asks God, and anyone who's been to Kol Nidre, of course, knows this. Knowing that says, and I'm paraphrasing, Nachi, you may know the words, I know I'm going to sin and I'm going to fail and I'm going to break promises in the years to come. I ask now for God to forgive me for these things because I know I'm intending not to do it, but I know I will. And of course, the medieval response to this was, you see, Jews are free to lie and do whatever horrible things they want to do. And this is the argument that's being made before the New York courts in 1800. And it is Alexander Hamilton who steps up and says, no. He doesn't really, I mean, he deals with the anti-Semitism, but there's something much more fundamental. And I think that's important when we think about religious rights, religious freedom, Jewish rights, even today. It isn't just a question of anti-Semites make stuff up and anti-Semites are dealing with stuff that's not true. But this idea of what Hamilton says, our system is you are to judge each person based on their own merits, not the merits of their father, not the merits of their co-religionists. Each person in a republic has to be you have to judge them individually, judge them by the content of their character. You cannot believe a Jew on oath, but you can't not believe it just because he's Jewish. If it doesn't work that way, the whole thing falls apart. a republic where some people will be believed in a legal sense, in a republic where you're going to be believed based on the group you're a part of, will fall apart, because then one group is trusted and one group is not, and equality goes out the window. And again, let's not be foolish here. Does Hamilton himself live up to that standard? No. Did the United States back then? Maybe ever? No. But as an ideal, suddenly people are talking about this. This is a big change from 20 years beforehand, when literally Aaron Lopez tries to become a citizen of the state of Rhode Island, and they literally say, no, you can't be a citizen. He is of the Hebrew faith. Now the idea that's being held up is to say we should each be judged. Every individual must be judged by their own character, and that is, and Hamilton wins. He wins that argument, and in that sense, it was at that point that a really important tool of American anti-Semitism lost. They lost an important tool that day. And I think it's worth pointing out that sort of these ways of thinking about Jews as citizens are stuff that happened in the Revolution, not in the 19th century, not with Ellis Island. They're taking place during the Revolution. Nothing wrong with Ellis Island. Love Ellis Island. Big fan. But sometimes the anti-Semites and other bigots will say, oh, these people, they didn't come here till later. So they're not part of the original team. No, they're part of the original team. This was something that was discussed in the Revolution. Were Jews citizens? Answer, yes.
And that's what the book really sets out to do. And I'll say that the book discusses a lot more than we did here. It focuses more on Seychelles and Shearith Israel and then Mikveh Israel and Philadelphia, a whole chapter on that. And you have more. You even start off a little bit about the Jews in South America in the beginning, their origins, and you discuss, again, there's just so much more full of information. As you know, and you talk a lot about these debates, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and the Jews for the Jeffersonian Jews, etc. So there's a lot of that in the book, and I'll link to the book. As I said in the beginning, it's $35, really good price. There's a good binding. A lot of books recently, I'll just say, have been poor quality. This is still a very good quality print. It's very eminently readable, even though it's scholarly. It's very readable for any listener. So I want to end off with one thing: is that what is the legacy, the Jewish revolutionary legacy, as you see it, after researching all this and writing this book?
I'll say this: the Jews don't do this on their own. They're not the only religious group out there that's fighting for these rights. Believe it or not, Baptists and Catholics are doing it too, because they're pretty small back then. I think the legacy, as I've said, is not only that Jews are part of it, that our republic has sort of this diversity baked into it, which doesn't just mean, oh, let's include everybody, but it does mean that, like, the people who actually came up with this stuff were a diverse group of people. But I also think that if there is a legacy, it is that, again, the fight for full citizenship, and we know this, the fight for citizenship it never ends, but that it also involves, I would say, it requires buy-in and participation, which is to say that Jews in America are not visitors and they are not guests. They are citizens. They were here as things got underway. And again, they're not alone in that. This is not, I don't want to replace the idea of, well, it was all Christians. Well, it was all Christians and Jews. That isn't true either. But rather this idea that the American experiment comes from a lot of different places. It doesn't just jump out of James Madison's head or George Washington's head. And that, whatever the legacy of the revolution, whatever mistakes might have been made, we can actually point to it and say there is a way in which freedom actually increases. They don't solve all the problems. But I think the question that we should ask is, did things improve? Did people have more freedom when it ended than when it began? And here's an example that we can point to that says yes. So I'm not sure the point of this book, in some ways, I didn't just write it for Jews. I sort of wrote it for everybody. Which is to say, the revolution is not a bad place to start thinking about freedom in the modern world and rights and representation in the modern world. It might not be the last thing to talk about, And I wouldn't want anyone to say it's perfect, but it is interesting that people who saw themselves as being free people went out and became citizens. And I think that's worth thinking about.
Absolutely. Definitely a very important and very interesting, fascinating read. So I'll link to that in the show's notes. Anyone interested can check it out. And thank you, Professor Jortner, for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks.